Love that. Love that, Mike. I'm don't let me steal your thunder on intro and
I just
pod.
wasn't queued up. I wasn't queued up with the music. So, let's just do this podcast. How's that sound?
That sounds great. Oh no, Mike. Now you're just not. Now your music is Mike. We're just doing a podcast.
No, I
I'm
know.
going to I'm going to say welcome to. Oh, there he is. There he is.
Defense returns it. Oh, it's Owen O'Malley. Oh my goodness. O'Malley's done it. 3-1.
The big switch. Gray can't keep it in. It goes out, and that is it. In 2025, Vermont is the king of soccer. And the Vermont Green win their first ever USL2 title. And green is the color of victory once again in Burlington, Vermont.
Hey, it's United Green Podcast. It's Mike again, back with you tonight. It's Wednesday night. We usually record on Thursdays, but we have a very special guest tonight. His time is very, very precious, and we just want to get a recording out this week, off the heels of last week's podcast, which was pretty popular. So I think we're going to top that this week with this guest, or at least let's hope. Let's hope. Tonight we have Sam with us. Sammy, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good, doing good. Glad that we got over your technical problems to start, but really excited to talk with our guest here. Obviously, very touching issues when it comes to the USL, and there's not a better man to talk about it with than our guest.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. We'll introduce him. He is former Vermont Green legend, first season Vermont Green legend. I know he's going to play that off, but probably one of the coolest mustaches I've ever seen. He really started the mustache revolution in Vermont. We give it to Coach Rob Dow, but and now he is the executive director of the USLPA. Connor Tobin, how you doing?
Hey, thanks for setting me up for failure to live up to those sort of expectations.
I tend to do that with our guests here. Um, so generally, when we have a new guest on, we start off. We just get a little bit of like a soccer origin story, and kind of what brought you into soccer, and got you to Vermont, and then where you are today.
Oh man, don't think that I have some spectacular origin story. I just played multiple sports as a kid growing up, moving around. I was actually probably when I was little more intrigued with baseball, but then I ended up hurting myself, and I was probably better at soccer. So then I started doing that more. I ended up in Colorado. I didn't really think for a long time I was going to play in college, probably until my junior year when I made the jump down to playing on a club team down there. Was recruited to multiple places, wanted to be on either coast. Vermont always sounded cool. Ironically, it was the one place I went on an official visit where I didn't go out with the guys and drink beers. And I still ended up at Vermont. Um, so went to UVM for 4 years. Uh, Came in as a scrawny outside back, worked my way into being a center back. Had enough piss and vinegar where I saw guys around the country going pro. Not that I thought that I was terrific, but I was at least competitive enough to say, hey, I want to try to do that. And yeah, went and hacked out a career mostly in the lower leagues of the United States. And yeah, at the tail end of that, when I retired professionally, ended up doing the PA stuff more full time, but also had a cup of tea with helping Vermont Green get off the ground year one on a variety of fronts, which, much to my chagrin, ended up on the field for the last couple of games. I didn't think that was going to happen, but it did, and yeah, it was a great experience.
And Connor, I will say there's an iconic picture again, not to set you up for expectation you can't reach. But I remember our photographer, John Alexander Dolan, got it of you. I forget what game it was, but I think you were, arms high in the air, and it's an iconic picture from Vermont Green and what I remember from our photographer. So I mean, I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts on, how do you look back on your time with the Green, and have you kept up with the club, as you've been more focused, with the PA stuff?
Yeah, so I mean the PA stuff I was involved with it. I was playing for 3-4 years, something like that. Um, and at the time I stepped away from playing professionally in Madison, the tail end of my career, always a piece where yes, I was doing the PA stuff, but I've always been very interested around, how do you get a club off the ground from scratch? How do you actually make it authentic? Spent a lot of time thinking about that during my career. It was at that time that got connected to Vermont, was intrigued by the project. I think I was a fit for what the club needed at the time in terms of more of an operations type person and brain. So I came in and I helped build out a game day operation and general club logistics. You know, think things as simple as, Tom Proctor and as the genius that he is in terms of the PA announcement, like we didn't have someone. What did that look like? And putting on a call. And I remember going down to brewery and Tom coming by and me sitting there thinking, holy shit, like this guy would be incredible on a mic. Let's just see what happens. And I lured him into doing it by telling him I'd bring him a 6-pack of beer every game. So just kind of like help the group hack it together. I think there was maybe a piece from the rest of the group. They thought I was going to come in and play, but I was coming off of ankle surgery, not all that intent about rehabbing and pursuing it. And then we ended up in a position going into the last game of the season. I believe it was Western New York, or not Western New York, Western Mass.
Yep.
And we were like a win and get in situation for playoffs.
Yeah, I think that was the game that our photographer got you pumped after the win.
I remember got the call from the coach, and basically asking me to play. I'm out of options because a lot of the kids went back to college, and I said sure. If you're asking me to be fit, I don't know if I'm 90 minutes fit. I also remember working at the clock 90 seconds in, and I said, "What the hell am I doing? This is a nightmare." I also remember being pretty explicit in the team huddle to all these young guys, eager college players in the summer, and it was just like, if any of you guys go run to get the ball for a throw in or a goal kick, I might fight you on the field. Slow down. All we need to do is score one goal to win this game. If you listen to what I'm saying, I promise you defensively we'll be all right. So if we turn over the ball, just know I'm immediately dropping to my 18-yard box and we're going to defend that way. And did that. And then Debo and Boegbo scored a goal. That was a great goal. Maybe a shank cross, but we'll take it. And hung on to get into playoffs. And I had something that I used to do in Madison with the Madison fans where I don't know how the league let me turn this into a thing, or Madison, but I used to go chug a 32-ounce beer in front of the fans in Wisconsin. So what's more Wisconsin than slamming a beer? Well, I decided to make a version off of playing with that, and that was probably the first maple syrup chug because I bought it on the way to the game, and I said, if somehow we win this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to chase that with a Bud Light, which I ended up doing.
And now it's a thing.
But in all seriousness, like I say it tongue in cheek, but like if we want to have authentic traditions and things like that, a lot of times it starts with things like that, and it's just okay. You go down these routes and people pick up on it. How do you do things that people in the crowd connect with? How do they resonate with that? And we're always walking a line and here in U.S. soccer, what is this idea of authenticity? And how do you walk this line and play off of that in a way where can you be authentic when it's never existed and you're creating it from scratch? And how do you have that interplay and what does that look like?
And I think that for what it's worth, the team, the club itself has kind of kept up that authenticity as much as they can with the explosion of popularity of not just the game in Vermont, but with even the USL too. You're seeing a lot of these, newer clubs, getting these huge numbers as far as attendance goes. We when we talk about that, we do talk about Vermont Green as far as they can kind of fill out that stadium and around and in and around the stadium. But we also talk about it with like a new club from last year in Annapolis who was drawing big numbers, and I think that's a huge thing in the USL2 especially, is that authenticity, and I think that most of the clubs in the USL2 try and strive for it. At least the more successful clubs try and strive for that authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, I generally think in our society, people are craving connection. I think that over the last 10, 15 years, things have become so globalized. And this is a very generic statement that people have lost that sense of connection. And there's been a move back to these things that are local where you feel connected and a part of that fabric, and that plays into this. And I give the club a lot of credit that I do think the general premise was right in terms of not starting with a soccer club and saying, hey, look at us, we're soccer, come get connected to this, which is unfortunately how a lot of U.S. soccer clubs have traditionally done this. Start with something that's broader than that, where quite honestly, I used to say this internally, um, my time at the Vermont Green, I don't give two shits if you like soccer. I give two shits if you like Vermont. I give you two shits if you like environmental justice, because that's a lot broader, it has a lot bigger appeal, and you start to cast a wider net and give people a more accessible standpoint. Soccer is just a vehicle by which we're connecting people.
Right.
It's a bigger concept, and that bigger fabric, I think, is more important.
Yeah, I mean, so you've been in the locker room, you felt the grind on the field, and now you're working at like a structural level in the USLPA. Um, so what kind of prompted that transition from becoming from playing on the field and becoming involved with the union, ultimately, becoming the executive director, and how does that kind of dual perspective like influence how you approach your job now with the PA?
It probably came because I'm a sicko from the playing side. I could never walk away from it because I loved it too much. And so even though I was a marginal player, I hacked out a career for far too long at this level. And because of that, I had a bunch of experiences where you were looking at this and, hey, how does this all work? And then what is the on the ground experience of players? And, why is this not moving forward? Why are we having some of the experiences that are super marginal? How do you change any of this? And it meant that when there was a bunch of instability and things happening in NASL, USL, USFD2, there's a whole history here of instability. But when NASL kind of fell away after the 2017 season, there was a group of us older players realizing that a lot of these experiences that we were having as players, there's no voice, quote unquote, at the table advocating for stability. Now, none of us knew what the hell we were doing, but we knew that every major sports league has a union, and that's the player voice. Well, we should have that. Well, how do you do that? What does any of that look like? None of us had a clue, but I was part of the older group of players that were dead set around the intention of, well, if I have a kid and he happens to play in this league, what is that experience going to be? And how do you lead the sport better than what you found it? And it's at that point we just started doing. There's not really a roadmap. I would say I ended up central in that. We got voluntary recognition at the end of 2018, which led us into collective bargaining. At the time when we were organized, it was only USL Championship. It was during that process they announced League One, so we organized that group, which became an umbrella group. But it took us 3 years of bargaining to get to a first ever contract. Well, I sat at the bargaining table for all of that, and you kind of hit some of these checkpoints, and it's like, oh crap, we actually got to that piece. Now we need a functional organization. We need to build this out. We need to scale this. And I was at the right point in my career, right motivation that said, well, I've been doing this. Why don't I not just kind of continue on this full time? So never really had a quote unquote transition where I went from, let me put on this hat to this hat. It was kind of like I was wearing both, and I just started to put more and more energy into this side, and then the titles and all that sort of stuff. I think anyone around Vermont Green will speak to this. I've never really been a big titles or any of this stuff. That's the whole stick around General Mountain Man when I was at the club. was like, I'm already doing this, so we'll just keep doing it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that kind of first, CB collective bargaining agreement that, the USLPA was able to come upon. I guess just how do you reflect on those early kind of bargaining discussions that you were having, and just what you were fighting for a league when you look at it, in the 2020s, about 5 years ago, all these professional sports leagues, they generally have these unions that are fighting for them and being able to get them, ideally what they want. But for the USL, it was a very new concept. Just what was it like, kind of, fighting for players' rights in those early days, where, like you mentioned, it was all kind of new and you were kind of trying to figure out how to do it best, as you went on.
Complicated, a lot of learning, even just learning the ins and outs of labor law. Um, I think the other thing that there was a lot of learning, and still is very hard to articulate to people who don't spend a lot of time with it, is how unique the USL's business structure is. Um, I think we use a lot of the same terminology you might use in the NBA, NFL, and we talk about franchises, but franchises in our business is something different than maybe NBA. It's something different than NFL. In our context in USL, the league itself is a privately held entity. They act as a national franchisor. When they sell franchises, they're literally selling to an individual territorial rights where you can operate a business under this. Um, Now, those individual businesses are direct employers of the players, um, and a lot of the stuff is decentralized, and there's a lot of benefit to that. However, there's also some negatives where if we decentralize all these decisions about how you want to run your club to 36, 40, or whatever the number is of operators and club owners, business owners, there can also be a lack of standardization. And what you'd seen historically in the lower leagues is Club A, great, super professional, everything you would expect. You go down the road, Club B, maybe less so. Club C, like, yeah, we're not even at the standard of Vermont Green. And so, very early on, from a player perspective, this has always been about defining the minimum standard in terms of player experience, no matter what club you're at. There should be some standard as a pro at this level in this country, whether that's the third division or second division, that doesn't matter the club, is going to have at least this professional standard. And I would argue that actually has a knock-on effect in terms of the quality of product that's put on field, the level of play, any of these sorts of things. It's good for the business, i.e., of defining that. So that first ever CBA that we got to, it was a 3-year process because it's really a 3-party negotiation, league, clubs, players, and then also we're not dealing with an analogous businesses. While a lot of these concepts might be similar, we have to craft solutions for USL and its business and its economics. That is very complicated. I think the first piece, how I've always thought about it, we have clubs going left, clubs going right, forward, backward. How do we just get everyone face the same direction? That's what the first CBA was. So a lot of the standards that are in the collective bargaining agreement that's expiring were like, what is the most basic line in the sand that we can draw and say, hey, this is professional, and now this successor agreement is really okay. How do we actually take steps in terms of the player experience beyond just like we're faced the same direction? How do we actually start to elevate this to actually what most people would consider to be professional?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So moving on, now you have you have your first CBA. How do those those issues that you start to deal with through the union and through the new process? How do the clubs themselves and the league respond to that? Because I know myself, and Sam knows this of me, is that I am vice president for technical professionals at the hospital here in Burlington.
Yeah.
When we joined, we already had this. We already had a union structure. When my group joined, I'm an X-ray tech, so we were all of the imaging techs joined in kind of an existing contract, a side letter. So when we joined, we already had that construct, and the hospital already knew, the business already knew how to deal kind of with union issues, whether it be member issues or a collective issue from the union itself. But because this is new for you guys, how does the at that point or up until this point, how has the league or the franchisers, the teams in general, reacted to the fact that the union is there? We have to kind of abide by our contract that we, negotiated together.
Yeah, I would say there's not one uniform response to that, and that looks a lot of different ways. I think before even just reaction, great, you define these things, let's say even a grievance process. Hey, a player has a contractual issue. Um, Certainly a big step forward getting to a collective bargaining agreement to actually be able to speak into players about a more equitable process to resolve those disputes that's not just weighted against the player and makes it practically impossible to take on anything. Okay, what does a letter of notice look like? How do you actually define what that is? What form should that take? There was a lot in terms of my role for the organization over the last 3, 4, 5 years is okay, figuring out what the heck that looks like and just doing it and creating buy-in, not just from the player end, from the employer end, and then it being the clubs, and then how do you get a buy-in from the league? So there's been a constant um, struggle is the wrong word, but effort putting into how do you define any of these processes and then getting buy-in. And that is still something where there's a number of issues where uh, I would say we're not very efficient about upholding some of the standards that are in the contract. That is part of what's being talked about here. And how do we get to something that actually functions smoother and actually ensures that the things that have been negotiated within the collective bargaining are upheld and respected?
And I think kind of too, Connor, kind of like you mentioned, there's been a lot of instability when it comes to soccer in the United States. You think of the early days of MLS and, whether it's the early 2000s or what have you, and, the other leagues as well, there was lots of concerns about stability. But, as the USLPA has kind of talked about, we're at this point where, the USL Championship is quite stable. I think of, up here in New England, Rhode Island FC opening up a great stadium and being able to pack stands there. You have Hartford Athletic, going on to win a Jägermeister Cup. I guess, when was your maybe sense of, we have to continue kind of this fight and make sure that now, obviously, we're just fighting for there to be kind of a standard and a bare minimum, that now we're in a place where we see the growth of, USL. We have to make sure that, our players are being represented in that growth and, their rights are also being represented there.
Yeah, two things I would say. I think you hit on a major theme for me, probably the defining feature for U.S. soccer, and not even from an MLS standpoint, but I'm talking go back to the 1920s, go back to the ASL. It's always been instability and like leagues cannibalizing each other. How do we actually set a foundation and build the infrastructure of the sport without it collapsing and starting again? So having a voice from a player perspective for a large part of that history has been lacking, which to me is always a little bit head scratching that you have an entity that literally is creating the product that doesn't speak into that at all and also bears a lot of the consequence that doesn't fully make sense. Um, I think as you get towards more, hey, where do we stand with our current collective bargaining agreement? And I'd say from a PA perspective, we're very concerned about balance. Um, and I think one of the things that people miss about balance is not a static concept. Balance evolves. One of the things that we're doing in a collective bargaining agreement is, hey, what is balance today? What is balance at some point in the future? And what is the pace of change as we evolve through that? And how do we get collective buy-in to doing that? Collective bargaining in its purest form should be a meeting point, a negotiation between the various parties about how are we going to grow this pie? How are we going to grow this business? And how are we going to share in that? It should not be an effort to divide the pie. One of the things I always think about in USL is I agree with the premise that, hey, this is maybe further along than other iterations of lower division soccer. If we think of where we were in 2011 to today, where we went from point A to club 100%. But that doesn't mean that that's the playbook to go from point B to point C. And there still needs to be an evolution here of how we create better balance as we're walking through this. And I say better balance, not just between players and clubs, but between the club and the league and how all this works. And finding that sweet spot where, hey, we're all pulling the same direction.
Yeah, I honestly believe, we do have a lot of unions who are, especially in this country, that have rich histories, right? Of building protections for workers, and a lot of those unions can be, unions that are strong collaborators with the businesses that their members work for and work with, and some become like very activist, and and you can build strength one way or another. I usually approach it from the standpoint of it's a collaboration, um, because I truly don't believe that you can if you're one sided and you have of one mind, you're not letting in the information that's coming from the business saying this is how we have to run it from a business standpoint. Where can we meet on this? It works conversely too. Um, there are always those sticking points where you just don't agree. Full and fair consideration is something that businesses love to use to kind of say, we hear you, but we're not going to do it your way. Um, from now that you're in this next negotiation, like from the player's perspective, like what are some of the kind of, and again, um, this is kind of taking the activist role, but what are some of the non-negotiables, like minimum pay, housing, healthcare, that kind of stuff, or off-season support for the players? What are some of those kind of non-negotiables that you guys are looking for, that you're saying, listen, these are the things we need to protect our players so that we can move on and continue to grow and build this landscape of soccer in the United States and in the USL.
Yeah, just let's address the theory part of this first. I am fully with you that, hey, and not just in a labor management relationship, but politically or these sorts of things, the way to get everyone kind of going the same direction is usually everyone end up with, name the number, 75, 80, 85% of what they want, but it's not 100% of what you want. Because that's usually, hey, how do we create overlap in the Venn diagram? If we can live in that sweet spot, everyone's feeling better about things, but you may not be 100% happy. I believe that's how we should approach a lot of things in this country. I think you walk into this interesting place where if you're walking in as a willing participant in that conversation and willing to come off the edges, but you're not met with reciprocal intentions or respect, what are you meant to do? Well, I think that for me, that's where the activist side of this comes in. I'm here to meet you in the middle. I'm here to let's have conversations. They're inevitably going to be difficult conversations. Well, usually those difficult conversations can be where we can get creative. But if you don't have a willing partner in that, then, well, I'm also very resolute. We're not going to be taken advantage of. So I think getting to like the more logistical piece around, championship players and the bargaining that we're currently involved in is that from our perspective, there's certain pieces in terms of employment conditions, specifically compensation, year-round compensation, in terms of employer-provided healthcare options, and generate more amorphous professional standards. So think things like what is per diem when you travel, like how are we paying for meals, like how many appearances can you force me to go do during the course of a season and do all this other work? Like, what does that actually look like? What are the guardrails around that? Do I get reimbursed for mileage when I go to these? Like very basic things that we think that there is absolutely, just on a human level, some standards that need to be met. People need to be able to put food on their table. This needs to be viable enough where you're not leaving this to go take a job driving Uber or whatever it is. Like, we've got to make this sustainable enough from a player perspective. If on the other side of this business, we're going to go, you know, pick X, Y, or Z story, there's enough of them that come out every week about expansion or pro rel or stadiums. Those two things have to work in unison.
Yeah, and I think also too, you touched on kind of the activism aspect, and I mean, I'd love to kind of get a sense of, obviously when you're at the bargaining table, kind of get the sense that, you're trying to have, a good discussion and trying to, represent, players' rights, but also to try, see, from the other side and the other point of view. I guess maybe when was the sense that you had to do some of these activism efforts? Obviously, we saw the social media campaigns, we saw the T-shirts, in the championship game. I guess when was the sense of we have to maybe take this a little more outwards? And then also too, just what was your reaction to kind of the fan support? Because obviously, I definitely think, the T-shirts, a lot of fans were kind of excited to see that, and fans were willing to participate in the social media campaign. What was it just like to see, those outsiders, the fans, be supportive of the efforts that you're making with the USLPA?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important in any of these things is context. We started negotiations in August of 24. We're over 32 sessions into bargaining back and forth on these topics. Um, Obviously, our deal expires December 31st. There is concern from our end about meeting that deadline. Um, we're also concerned about the distance that remains between the parties, and at some level, that gets into as a group of players, do you feel respected in how this conversation's unfolded? Um, Sometimes, if you feel like certain pieces are lacking, then you know beyond just using your voice at the bargaining table, there's other ways to go and do that. And I think obviously with the championship game, you saw that from our players to kind of say, hey, like we feel the need to use our voice in another way to create awareness. I give them a tremendous amount of credit in terms of realizing their agency in this and getting to that point of willingness to do this. Like I think the players off of Tulsa and Pittsburgh deserve a lot of credit. You work a whole season and sometimes a whole career to try to get to a championship piece, and to use your platform in that moment to make a message on behalf of all players, a tremendous amount of respect to all of those guys that made that choice. Now, and all the stuff that played out after it, I can't speak to all the decisions that were made. What I can say is it's disappointing to have decisions get made about taking away a moment that is so seminal, that it's so central to any sports league that it considers itself professional. Um, to have that taken away because there's concerns about players using their voice, I'm waiting for someone to describe how that makes sense to me. And I certainly share in the sentiment that's been shared to me by a number of players that were on Pittsburgh. Once you kind of get down off of the euphoria of lifting the trophy, of saying, man, I'm very disappointed in how that went down. And I think there is a piece where from a player end, people can disagree about using the platform and certain things, but certainly a desire for the league to show more respect towards its players.
Yeah, kind of building on that. I mean, do you feel that there's been some sort of maybe misunderstanding or miscommunication from like the clubs or the league itself about what players are asking for? Um, do you feel like it's more of like they're using the excuse of the obstacles being financial or structural? And like then at the same time, how do you balance advocating for those higher standards when they're saying, we don't have the money, we have to operate on a tighter budget? How do you kind of balance advocating for those standards when they're constantly telling you we don't have the money to do this?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've wrestled with from the jump from a USLPA end, and I think that again, in the spirit of cooperation and trying to grow this, we've always come to the middle. I think I will always link this back to the piece that I said at the start in terms of what is the business structure of it? USL, not some other sports league, but USL. If we have a privately held league, okay, that's one entity. We have clubs that are a different entity, players that are a different entity. So when you say, hey, we don't have the money, or hey, this doesn't work with our finances, I think we have to have more clarity about which entity we're talking about, and is there balance between all three entities?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I guess, like you've mentioned, you had many bargaining discussions, and we are now to the point, it's closing in on the new year. I guess just what are kind of the options that the USLPA is kind of, willing to take, the paths they're willing to go, kind of as we near kind of this quote unquote deadline, as the end of the year. Just how are you approaching reaching kind of a milestone date, if you will?
Yeah, I think we have every intent from players that we want to get to a deal. We recognize how pivotal a moment this is for the league, for the sport in this country, going into a World Cup year with some of these bigger ambitions on the horizon. This is important. Um, I will say the feedback that we've consistently gotten from the player pool that, hey, there needs to be meaningful changes in terms of what this looks like in terms of balance vis-a-vis players. And players are intent on getting to a deal that they feel is balanced. And that is not something that's a secret. That's something that we've said consistently at bargaining over the last 15 months, and we're going to continue to say. So, to answer the question of, hey, what does the future hold? I don't know. And I say that because we're in any of these things, depending on other entities and how willing are they to meet in any of this stuff. And there's a lot of things to be determined. We'll figure out those things as we go. But what I can speak to is the conversations we've had with players, the conversations that we've had organizationally. We remain intent on getting to a deal, but we're also intent on that deal being fair and balanced.
Yeah, and also too, real quick, I mean, I'd love to touch upon it. Obviously with the North Carolina situation that recently happened, it kind of highlighted maybe sort of the fragility that still can be in place. When all of a sudden, a team just disappears, and, goes on break, and players who had contracts. I remember, I believe it was Tyson mentions it, Mike. A young player who was coming from college, and ended up getting signed, and then now he's without a contract and also without that college eligibility. I guess as USLPA, just what was your reaction to that, and can you maybe talk about how the PA is looking to kind of fight for players' rights? You mentioned kind of year-long pay in terms of providing some stability for players when something bad happens, like a club folding.
Yeah, I mean, this is historically getting to like a core issue of how we organized. People don't realize that prior to a first CBA, and this was visibility and where the sport was at, clubs were still folding then, and guys on multi-year guaranteed deals, well, your contracts were written in a way where the contract was amended to end at the end of the current season. You got nothing on the future years of your contract. Think about that for a half second. Like as a player, I might really love Vermont. Let's, for the sake of thought experiment here, let's consider that Vermont's at a professional level. I like it so much, and my spouse likes it so much that, you know what, I'm actually willing to take less pay for guaranteed years. I want security. And then someone else makes choices that says, well, that security done and dusted. And now you're left with very real expenses in real time. How do I pay for rent through the offseason? How do I find a new contract? How do I move my family? All these things are up in the air. So that was the historical players are left holding the bag. We came to bargaining the first time around in 2021, and we fought like cats and dogs on this issue. And the perspective um, from the employer side was, well, this is a hard business. We may have entities that go bankrupt. And really what we're doing from a collective bargaining agreement, any sort of thing here would be reordering the line of creditors. That's not something we're willing to do. Well, we went back and forward on this. This is where, hey, North Carolina, these guys got 2 months of pay. That's ultimately where that negotiation landed. And at the time, you're balancing, it's not just this one issue, there's a plethora of other issues because it was unregulated. Okay, let's put the line in the sand and let's move this forward. Okay, we're still in this position. And I would say over my tenure of being in this place, I've lost track of how many times this decision has been made. I've yet to see a Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 filing. This has always been an individual choice. And we're still in a place, yes, it's marginally better, but players are disproportionately carrying the cost of this. 2 months, will that get you through a couple months of rent? If you've got a family and kids, is that going to pay for food on the table? You still got to move them. Hold on a second. What happens if you're actually injured? Let's say I got unlucky and towards the end of the season I tore my ACL and I'm going to be out half of the upcoming year. Okay, if the club had continued, I'm walking back in, I'm continuing to get paychecks, I'm rehabbing. As I get close to getting healthy, I'm training in a team environment, which certainly helps acclimating. Oh, and when I get cleared, I got the second half of the season to go and play, to get back on the field, to show that I still have it. So when I end up out of contract, I maybe don't take a big of a hit in terms of my market value. Let's take the situation in the club folds. Well, here's your 2 months. Okay. You still have coverage for the injury through workers' comp, which the clubs are obligated for. Those benefits, you're just training on your own all the way through that to get healthy. And the moment you get cleared, those work comp benefits stop. You don't have a contract. It's the middle of a season. How many contracts are actually out there that you can go and get? Even if you're able to secure one, have you really shown that you're back to full strength? What is the dollar offer that's going to be on the table? So players are so badly disadvantaged in this that there are still real structural problems. And again, not on decisions that we would necessarily make. It might be a decision from a particular club owner that says, hey, I don't want to do this. That's fine. But also, okay, we've had all these teams come into it. Who lets those teams in? Do they have a model that's ready? Who makes that decision? That's a league decision. Does the league backstop any of this, or are players left holding the bag? So this kind of gets back to this idea of what I'm saying about structure. This is really three parties about how do we balance this? And listen, I get that as much as I would like it to be, progress is never linear. And we're going to have this stop-start nature. But how do we do it in a balanced and equitable way? And that takes all three entities participating in that conversation.
That's wow. That was one of the greatest answers that we've had on this podcast. Yeah, and thorough and really shows like kind of the struggles that you have some of these quote unquote lower league players that they have to go through. We see it a lot with like minor league baseball players, single A baseball players. People who have been toiling in the minors for years and years and years, and the way that I feel right now is that looking at the USL, that's kind of the way that the league is treating these players in the league in general. They have these giant, big aspirations of competing with the MLS, but they're still treating their players like they're minor leaguers when they're truly not minor leaguers. They are truly professional, high functioning, players with amazing abilities that can compete on the highest levels of the sport, and they're not taking care of these players. I guess now, given the growth of like where the league wants to go, whether it's making that premier division and going into pro rel, expansion, all these big structural changes that they're talking about, even with the women's side as well, having the USLW and the USL Super League, as far as your contracts go, because you do have the USL one, you have the women's league, and you have the championship plus the likelihood of a whatever quote unquote premier division. Where does that leave you as far as contracts? Because in my experience with the unions in my hospital and speaking to some of the other healthcare unions across the country, is that many times you have different contracts throughout the business. And what the business generally doesn't want is for those contracts to align, because more people equals more power. And when your members are advocating, starting to advocate for themselves and organizing in a way that they are excited to go out there and talk to their leadership and be able to move the conversation forward and protect themselves, protect their families. I think that, like, it's imperative that we align, in a powerful way for a greater good. So do you have any kind of ambitions for aligning those contracts of those leagues in the future, or is this just, or are we just kind of starting a conversation where we need to solidify one league, one contract at a time? So I think that, in the end, like, having one solid contract would be best for your league. But I don't run your union, so.
So I want to just revisit something you said, kind of about, the aspirational piece versus the on the ground reality and kind of where we are as players. I think that's the core of the messaging on the shirts from the championship weekend. The other piece that I'm quick to remind, we have players that are going to play in the World Cup this next summer, playing in USL. You have dedicated professionals that work hard at their craft every day. And I'd actually go beyond that, that we have a bunch of individuals that are dedicated to trying to grow the sport in this country and grow these local communities and grow our clubs as community assets. I generally believe that we have a large number of players that think like that. Now, in terms of advocating from a contract perspective, the situation ending up with these different tiers, obviously USL has grown a ton since we got to our first collective bargaining agreement in 2021. I think it's no surprise that you've seen a lot of this happen as we standardize it, as the USLPA has gone about its work of trying to enforce that contract. You've seen a lot of growth. We've seen quote unquote new product lines, Women's Super League, and those sorts of things. From a foundational perspective, you have to unionize those shops. What does that look like? How do you gain recognition? So from a theory standpoint, we're an umbrella union with different contracts. Yes, I think you can absolutely get into conversations about organizing power and, how do you align workers and contracts. I think it's such early doors in terms of the growth of USL that those are a lot of open-ended questions. What I would say, at least on the men's side of things, promotion relegation and having potential movement between different business units with different contracts, this idea of promotion relegation is going to take coordination across collective bargaining agreements. And I think this is one of the core pieces on a lot of these big things that have been out there from a PA perspective. It's like, yeah, it's intriguing. Yeah, there's probably a lot of validity about this. How that actually mechanically comes together, we've wanted to understand. We wanted to at least understand from the employer what the plan is, especially in a place where we're being asked to bargain a new contract. Well, a lack of details around that makes that extremely challenging. So to even get to the point of tackling some of the more esoteric questions that you're asking, very, very difficult.
Definitely, and I think it's a key point that you mentioned. You have players, obviously in the World Cup, but also too, constantly featuring their national teams, and the fact that the things that you are asking, I would say they're not necessarily the most out of this world. You just for me, I remember hearing about the health insurance, and for me thinking of these athletes who are putting their bodies on the line, they're dealing with these injuries, for them to not have employer provided health insurance. If I was someone signing up for a job, like it would be almost insane to believe. So it's a key point to mention that these are some high quality players. And I think too, obviously there's lots of discussion, mostly again from the MLS side, about a calendar change. Obviously the USL Super League plays on a different calendar. I guess with how difficult these discussions have been. If USL, again, we're in theoretical land, but if there was to be a change, just how difficult do you think those conversations would be from a player representative standpoint when you're now trying to figure out how to adapt to an entirely new schedule and adapt to these contracts?
Certainly, there's a number of pieces where CBA would be affected. I think it's important to clearly articulate those conversations. We have not had any of those conversations. That hasn't been initiated by either party. Um, Now, you look at leagues that have gone through this transition, in leagues that have been really kind of fully thoughtful and strategic about this, it's probably a 3 to 5 year runway to do it. That takes time. That's how many sort of impacts. What does this look like in terms of transitioning and working through all those details? It's complicated. So it is pretty dynamic in terms of getting to that. The other piece, and sorry to reroute the conversation back to this, is the healthcare piece I just want to touch on because again, from a reality standpoint, I don't think a lot of people understand this. Is like, sure, players would we have coverage and we've negotiated a standard that, hey, if I get injured playing soccer, as during the more traditional sense of my employment, I have coverage to work comp. But if we go back to the structure of USL, well, we're direct employees of wherever that club is. So even our guys about, okay, you have coverage through work comp, that has a tremendously different meaning in the state of Florida than it does in Massachusetts. Like, and then how do we navigate that? How do you create clarity for a player, particularly when, hey, a large number of our players are foreign, they have no concept of that. How do you navigate that? And again, that only deals with the quote unquote workplace injuries. What we're focused on in terms of the employer provided health care is a different segment of this, and this is the one that keeps me up at night. What happens, players driving to an appearance or driving home, gets back from a road trip, he gets off the team bus, gets back in his car, he's driving home, and knock on wood, this never happens, but it's the catastrophic car accident. What does coverage for that player look like? We have a bunch of young players that are introduced to this. Their understanding of any of this is limited. There could be foreign players that don't even understand that they don't have coverage. And what is the human impact of this? We've had situations. You guys can go dig on these. There's a pretty big one this last year where we're walking into that territory. And from a human cost standpoint, are we okay sitting here and talking about all these aspirational things and all these things that excite people, but the human side of that we have these massive blind spots where like this can be really, really life-changing for someone in the worst way?
Oh, Mike losing his audio. Wow.
I just didn't hit the mute button again. Listen, my tech issues. I do another podcast. We won't mention it because it's for a Premier League team that's not doing so hot right now. But they call me Techno Mike because I can't ever figure out my microphone situation. But this is an incredibly important conversation to have, and I think right now, like in the United States and in general, but in the world, obviously in the wider world, in the grander scheme of things, healthcare is a big issue. But in the United States in general, because we have a pay-to-play system here in the United States, we're getting to a point where only the most fortunate are able to have healthcare that provides health and safety and stability for them and their families. In your experience, and this is kind of going to play into your answer. It really is going to play into a listener question that we're getting. I'm going to put that right up there. But does the U.S. Soccer Federation have any part to play in this conversation? Not just like with the collective bargaining conversation, but in the grander scheme of things as far as like healthcare for these players, because I think that is like can be the benchmark for how things play out in future negotiations for you guys.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, from where I sit, and I want to be fully transparent. Like this is my perception. I may not have the full purview of everything. I don't sit in other people's shoes, but from where I sit, absolutely. U.S. soccer sits across all aspects of the sport in this country. In terms of the pro game, they sanction the various pro leagues. They set PLS standards, pro league standards, um, and they're the ones that make decisions around that. In my personal opinion, does that mean that U.S. soccer should take a more active interest in terms of some of the things out there around player experience? It's my belief that they should. Um, I think that would be really important to living up to this idea of, we're here to be guardians of the sport and the people that partake in it.
Yeah, and Connor, I'd love to kind of allow you to as well, just in terms of, obviously, negotiations have been going on for so long. There has been kind of this outward support, from fans of the game. As we kind of come up on an hour, just how could, the soccer fan, the USL soccer fan, who's looking to maybe support the USLPA or support its efforts, is there any sort of way they can either show their support or maybe get involved?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'll take it from the aspect of a U.S. soccer fan. And maybe this is self-serving, so take it with a grain of salt. I think there's been a lot of conversations about the 26 World Cup, and I get that a lot of people are excited. I also know that some people are starting to have the conversation of how does this transform U.S. soccer. We're at this kind of inflection point. I actually believe one of the most important stories happening right now in U.S. soccer is this bargaining that we're engaged in right now. Because what we're talking about is what are the standards for closer to what the base of the professional game is here? How are we going to elevate that? Okay, in terms of a player experience, how are we going to make this more viable so that good players are not choosing to leave the game, not because, hey, they no longer have a hunger for it, or hey, physically they can't do it. We have players that have been leaving this sport for multiple decades because it's not viable. And if we constantly have this attrition of good players, we are bringing down the level by holding a better standard. We're going to put a better product on the field, not just in terms of this league, but it moves the whole pyramid forward. And the other piece that I think is really important here is look at the evolution of MLS. It's exciting for what that league's becoming and how they've gone about things, and certainly bringing in more and more foreign players in the league is exciting. Are you seeing as many domestic guys get opportunities? Where are they getting minutes? What league are they playing in? We need to care about this in terms of the sport from an American point of view of whether we're moving this forward. I think because of that, like what is going on now, if fans want to like help move this forward, one of the core issues that we've had is it's an issue of visibility, right? Like, and this is natural. Everyone is attracted to the top level of everything. It's easy to get excited about it. It's harder as you go down it, where it's, hey, how do I access it? How do I talk about this? So I really do believe at a core level what we're talking about is awareness and education of what is going on. What does this look like? Why does this matter? And I think if the general soccer fan here in this country, at least from a U.S. perspective, because there's always been this hunger from an American point of view, like, hey, like we want our national team, moving forward and competing for World Cups and doing all this stuff, and why aren't we there and all these sorts of things. I think we have to take a broader view. And even though that this feels like there's distance from, there's a direct link to all of this stuff. And creating that awareness, educating on why it's all connected, I do believe is kind of the first step in, hey, moving this again in terms of an upward trajectory in this country.
Guys, this has been such an amazing conversation. I think we could probably go on for another hour or so. But I know that time is short, and everybody has bedtimes coming up and family time coming up. So I just want to thank you guys for being here. As always, Sam, I love and respect you. And no matter what Tyson says, you are a true journalist, a real journalist.
Nah. Love Tyson, love Tyson. Missed them tonight, but
Yeah.
the pleasure is all mine, and really appreciate Connor taking the time. A great conversation, and hopefully the listeners kind of now understand what the USLPA is fighting for, and hopefully can go out and show their support.
Yeah,
Yes.
Connor, if you could just shout out, kind of where you can be found, and what your next steps are in this journey, because I'm sure that folks want to hear, or want to be able to find, and track what's going on with this negotiation, because it is super important to the sport that we have adopted here in Vermont, especially in the sport that we love. So
USL players, primarily Instagram, I think is probably the biggest platform for us right now. So that's a great place to get information. So encourage anyone that's interested in this and wants to follow along, follow us there, and stay tuned. And we'll see where this all goes. And at some point, we'll figure out an agreement and hopefully move this thing forward.
and we'll look forward to seeing you guys next season on the field. And until next time, I do want to say we are the United in Green podcast. We're supported by the Blazing Musket. Blazing Musket is a soccer website, New England soccer website, and they cover everybody from little old Vermont Green, the biggest club in the world, all the way up through the MLS, the New England Revolution, and all of the in-betweens, Rhode Island FC, Portland Hearts of Pine, and we might get some Boston Bolts action in there too. You never know. But, until the next time, guys, I just want everybody to go out there, be safe, and protect your mental health. And as always, up the green.
Up the green.
Appreciate it, guys.
Just for one.